Okay, so let me record. Where is the record? Oh, it is recording already. Right, fine. You know how all over the place I am. Okay. So today we are having Erika Marcet from Dublin State University. She is in her final year of PhD project, and you're working on the developing pragmatic competence in the learner of Japanese in Irish higher education context. And it is very much sort of, it has sort of applied flavor as well as having theoretical underpinning. So, and now Erika is at the stage of finishing data analysis, and now she's being told to write discussion chapters by her supervisors. Unlucky. So any feedback you could give Erika would be very much welcome, I believe. So anyway, rather than me talking at you again, I think I'll leave it to you, Erika, wherever you want to start.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm just going to share my screen there. Sorry. Okay, can everyone see the slide fine? Yeah?
Yeah. Oh, we can actually see the next slide and so on, your notes as well.
You can see that?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we can see your view. The first time you shared it, it worked perfectly. We could see.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna close that for a second. Perfect.
Yeah. Perfect.
Perfect. Yeah. Great. Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Erika, and thank you very much for being here, and thank you Ryoko and Kate, of course, for inviting me today. It is an honor, I have to say, to present my research today, but I'm also quite nervous, I have to admit, because I am surrounded by such a great range of experts in relevance theory. But I believe this is a valuable learning experience for me, and hopefully for you as well. I genuinely hope that you enjoy my research and my findings as almost as much as I benefited from yours. And I want this, as Ryoko said, to be an opportunity to hear your input, feedback, comments, criticisms even. They are definitely welcome ahead of my Viva. So today I will be talking about pragmatic challenges and relevance in the foreign language context. And I will be presenting and discussing some challenges that learners of Japanese as a foreign language faced in oral interaction with L1 or native speakers during their study abroad programs and work placements in Japan. And I will be examining these challenges through the lens of relevance theory, as well as against the wider interlanguage pragmatics context. So I will do that by introducing the context of my study, first including some key terminology and identifying some of the research gaps. I'll briefly outline the methodology, and then I will talk about and discuss the findings of my study, as well as present some possible implications that it might have. So the first thing I will define is the concept of interlanguage pragmatics. So the term interlanguage pragmatics, or ILP, is rather recent. It was coined about exactly 3 decades ago in 1991 by Gabriela Kasper and Marcet Dahl. And ILP is an interdisciplinary field that draws from the general field of pragmatics, as well as from second language acquisition. And interlanguage pragmatics, it traditionally examines the comprehension and production of speech acts among L2 or foreign language speakers. So since the term ILP was first coined, its definition has evolved to reflect a wider concept of pragmatics that encompasses a range of domains such as the use, perception, acquisition, development, teaching, assessment, etc., of pragmatic competence. However, even if researchers have expanded ILP's range of domains, the most popular research pragmatic phenomenon remains the production and, to a lesser extent, interpretation of speech acts. So ILP researchers have mainly focused on whether speech acts can be taught and how can they be taught, how can they be assessed, whether learners transfer L1 speech acts to their L2, whether the study abroad context enhances the development of speech acts. You get the gist by now. It's very much focused on speech acts. And even other aspects of pragmatics, such as implicatures, have been examined through speech acts. So this overemphasis means that several other pragmatic features have been either neglected or examined through very narrow approaches to interlanguage pragmatics. So my research originates from the need to better understand how non-speech act related challenges arise and which kind of challenges learners are likely to encounter in oral interaction in the L2. In my case, it's in Japanese oral interaction. The second concept I would like to discuss is that of pragmatic competence. And in interlanguage pragmatics, pragmatic competence has been mainly examined through the lens of communicative competence. So it is a component, a fundamental component, they say, of communicative competence. And pragmatic competence is defined as the ability to use language appropriately in a social context. So pragmatic competence is very much sociolinguistically and socioculturally driven within this ILP tradition. Within models of communicative competence, ILP researchers argue that pragmatic competence involves linguistic knowledge and social knowledge, and that both knowledge types are distinct processes. And we have a graph here that represents that distinction. So ILP researchers tend to divide pragmatic competence into pragmalinguistics and sociopragmatics. Pragmalinguistic competence refers to the linguistic resources that learners use to perform pragmatic functions. And sociopragmatic competence then refers to the understanding of socially and culturally appropriate rules that guide these linguistic resources. So scholars in ILP believe that in order to interact effectively and appropriately, learners need to know the linguistic forms, the function of these forms, and the social rules that allow them to appropriately function in the L2 context. So such distinction between pragmalinguistics and sociopragmatics suggests that the only function of pragmatics is to bridge the gap between linguistics and their uses in social contexts. But pragmatics is not concerned with just social factors or how social factors interact with linguistic meaning. Pragmatics is about inference. So as hearers do in their L1, in their first language, learners also need to know how to attribute communicative intentions and adapt to interlocutors to successfully infer the meanings implied in the L2. So as Angelique Itzan, Eli Infantidou, and Bessie Mitsicapolo, and I hope I didn't pronounce that too badly, they argue that a division between pragmalinguistics and sociopragmatics is conflictive because pragmalinguistics and sociopragmatics are the result of a developing cognitive ability to process language. They are not the end goal of pragmatic competence, but rather resources that can help unpack L2 learners' inferential abilities. So examining these two competencies as two distinct domains misleadingly suggests that two distinct cognitive processes are involved in the production and interpretation of meaning. So such claims also suggest that most ILP research, as Eli Infantidou rightly points out, has been conducted independently from current developments in cognitive pragmatics. So yes, of course, some interactions and some instances of miscommunications originate due to learners' inability to operate according to social norms and cultural norms in the foreign language. But many misunderstandings also arise as a result of learners' either incorrect or deficient processing of utterances in DL2, and we will see that when I present the findings. So that is to say that, unlike how ILP researchers tend to suggest, even if communicative acts are socially and culturally defined, they are first and foremost cognitively driven. And that is why I adopt Eli Fantidu's definition of pragmatic competence, as it examines it from a cognitive perspective rather than a communicative perspective. So in this cognitive approach to pragmatics, being able to act appropriately in a social context is not the goal. The goal is to be able to infer meaning correctly by activating a number of cognitive processes, such as, of course, knowledge of social conditions, but also knowledge of logical rules, mind reading of others' intentions and beliefs, and interpreting each other's behaviors. So pragmatic competence allows learners to tap into their inferential abilities to process utterances in DL2. And in this framework, pragmatic competence is activated or developed by cognitive adjustment of effort and effects in the search of a relevant overall interpretation. So instead of dividing pragmatic competence between pragmalinguistic and sociopragmatics, in this framework, pragmatic competence is made up of three interrelated cognitive processes, which are linguistic awareness, which is the ability to identify linguistic forms, pragmatic awareness, which is the ability to retrieve relevant pragmatic effects, and metapragmatic awareness, which is the ability to establish and explain the link between the linguistic forms and the pragmatic effects. So with all that in mind, I will now turn to a brief description of how I collected data that helped me identify the main pragmatic challenges that learners faced in oral interaction with L1 speakers in Japan. So data was collected between February 2018 and January 2019, and participants were undergraduate students enrolled in 2 Irish universities. And these students were either in Japan at the time of data collection, or they had returned from the country after their study abroad or work placement programs. All participants had been in Japan for at least 6 months and up to 2 years. And the first thing that I did was I administered 32 questionnaires, which were exploratory in nature, and they were open-ended. And these questionnaires served to identify major challenges emerging from pragmatics research in general and Japanese linguistics in specific. Then I conducted 12 interviews with the same cohort of students, so students who had already answered the questionnaires, and to kind of expand the challenges that emerged from the questionnaires. And finally, I conducted 6 focus group discussions with a different cohort of students who had returned from Japan recently. And the focus group discussions were a means to corroborate the pragmatic challenges that appeared in the 2 previous cycles of data collection. And focus group discussion also were more explicit in nature, in the sense that learners talked about more language use problems through concrete examples. So what are the challenges that learners faced in oral interaction with L1 speakers in Japan? The data that came out of my research is very rich and fairly complex in the sense that it doesn't focus on one particular challenge, but it rather encompasses a wide range of phenomena that involve inference. So these are not challenges per se, the ones that you see on the screen, but rather features of the Japanese language that learners discussed during data collection. So participants reported challenges in interpreting and producing speech styles, ellipses, prosody, silence, hedges, or softening expressions, gestures, especially those that were culturally specific, humorous effects, and back-channeling. As there is quite a lot to unpack here, and I'm very conscious of time, of course, I will only focus on a few of these challenges, these ones marked in red. So the first two phenomena I will talk about are speech styles and ellipses, as they were the two features of Japanese language that were discussed the most among participants. So Japanese has a variety of speech styles available to speakers, some of which are encoded and imposed pragmatic constraints, such as the two main types of honorifics, the ones commonly referred as referent honorifics or honorifics, or keigo in Japanese, and the ones commonly referred to as addressee honorifics or polite or formal forms. Other forms that do not fall into these two categories are called casual forms, and I will show you an example of that. So in Japanese, there are at least 3 different ways of expressing where are you going. So the first one uses dochira as the honorific version of the question word where, while the formal and casual forms use the question word doko, which means the same, where, but it's less formal. In addition to that, the verb completely changes. So the honorific form of to go, it is irashaimasu, while the formal version of it is ikimasu, and the casual form changes to iku. So as you can see, there's quite a bit of change there. And finally, to mark that this is a question, speakers use the interrogatory particle ka in more honorific and formal speech styles, but may change that to no, which is also a particle in casual speech styles. So as you can see, all 3 speech styles take place at clause final positions. They are accomplished through verbal morphology, although we have the question word here, which also changes, so that's an added difficulty. Speech styles also index formality, affect, and attitudes, and they are not static, but they can be mixed in one single interaction with one same person. So in oral interaction, interlocutors must constantly choose whether to employ one of the 3 forms, unless the speaker chooses to leave utterances incomplete, which I will talk about when I discuss ellipses. So such choices are not socially driven, as it has been claimed in communicative approaches to ILP, but they are rather cognitively driven. That means that learners must have the ability to read their interlocutor's mind and attribute intentions to adjust their choice of speech style to a given situation and within one single interaction. So during their time in Japan, all participants agreed that there was a general sense of an awareness about speech styles, how to use them, their functions, etc. So this awareness resulted in learners requiring what one student described as mental gymnastics, which would be higher processing effort to interpret and produce speech styles appropriately. So verbal forms change, and these new forms differ from forms participants expected or were used to as they learned them in the classroom and from textbooks back in Ireland. So as a result, learners could not recover the intended meaning of the proposition expressed, resulting in instances of communication breakdown, which were rather frequent, and as you can see in the example here. So there's this female student who says, sometimes you missed an awful lot of what was happening in a conversation because you were trying to figure out what it was in a full and polite, proper grammatical form. So this hindered their ability to even hold a conversation in their daily activities, such as at the supermarket, at the post office, at the doctor's. And these interactions were often described as a terrible and frustrating experience. So learners often had to ask Japanese speakers to rephrase their utterances, for which L1 speakers then provided all the syntactic information and changed to the formal form of speech styles, which is the one that learners had learned in the classroom and the ones that learners were used to. And of course, then that facilitated the interpretation process. At the production side, some learners opted to consciously diverge from the norms or expectations and use a speech style that would have been considered perhaps inappropriate, but that they felt more comfortable with, either because a case of subjectivity or because they had learned it in the classroom. But some learners also expressed the opposite, so that they diverged from the norms or expectations unconsciously, because they did not know how to use speech styles appropriately, and because they had certain speech styles so ingrained in their cognitive environment that they would use that speech style in particular as the default. So first, their default speech style would be the formal form as a result of the classroom learning. And then as interaction went on in Japan, especially casual interactions with friends and at university, they would start using more casual forms as the default. So such diversions, either consciously or unconsciously, frequently resulted in pragmatic failure, of course, and interpersonal issues such as coming across as too rude, too cold, or even too standoffish. And we can see an example here in this quote where this male learner, his friend felt that he was being almost disrespectful for the kind of speech style he was using, which was too formal for the situation. So closely linked to the use of casual speech styles, another difficulty that learners encountered is in relation to ellipsis. So according to the literature, the rate of ellipsis in Japanese is between 50% and 80%, while ellipsis in English ranges between 0% and 25%. So as we know, the use of syntactically incomplete utterances can be problematic as they can be pragmatically complete in the eyes of the speaker, but seem incomplete according to the hearer. So because of that, learners often described the Japanese as being indirect, vague, or even ambiguous. But it's not that Japanese is indirect or that the language is indirect, but it rather admits more instances of pragmatic omission of elements retrievable from context. And here we have an example of that, and it's the same example as before. So the question, where are you going? In the formal form, we have anata wa doko ni ikimasu ka? So anata being you, in casual interactions, it tends to be ellipted, it tends to be dropped. So it becomes doko ni ikimasu ka? Ni is a postpositional particle that indicates direction. And oftentimes in casual interactions, postpositional particles are also ellipted. So it becomes doko ikimasu ka? Of course, we saw that speech styles change. So even if I wanted to say that in a more formal way, in the casual form, I would change the ka form to the particle no. So it would become doko iku no. But I could also drop this final sentence particle and it would become doko iku, and I would use prosody to indicate that this was a question. And finally, I could drop the verb altogether and simply say doko, where, to mean where are you going. So of course, that is challenging for students. So at the production level, participants seemed generally aware of subject ellipsis as a phenomenon, but unaware of its function and application in oral interaction. So one of the most common mistakes among participants was that, and we can see this in the first quote, in the first example, that they tended to omit subjects when there was not enough contextual cues being provided, thus making information difficult to recover by L1 speakers, by Japanese speakers. So some participants even mentioned having a few arbitrary rules about the application of ellipses. So some would say, oh, I would drop the subject one, I would say the subject once and then I would drop it during the rest of the conversation. Or I would omit X, Y, and Z particle. But if you asked them why, they couldn't explain it. It was simply mirroring Japanese oral interaction as they had seen it in Japan. On the opposite side, though, some learners tended to include subjects and other grammatical elements that could have been perfectly omitted when there were enough contextual cues to derive meaning, as it is suggested in the second example. So this was often the result of L1 transfer, as in English, as we saw, subjects are mostly included. So at the interpretation side, learners did say that interpreting subject ellipsis in isolation was rather difficult, as they found it challenging to recover the referent, as seen in the example here. So there was a lot of confusion. Who are we talking about? Are you talking about me? Are you talking about someone else? So of course, when Japanese speakers said the word tired or seems tired, the subject was missing, so the learners couldn't understand who was being talked about. And that created quite a lot of confusion. So the majority of participants felt that recovering elliptic particles, in isolation was not a major challenge, but it became difficult in combination with other types of ellipses and the use of casual speech styles. So there was this one participant in a focus group who said, well, the Japanese omit particles, they omit verbs, they omit pronouns and subjects, they sometimes omit whatever it might be. It might as well be Chinese, that I would be understanding the same thing. So this indicates that the more syntactic gaps, the more difficult it was for learners to recover information. So what do these two challenges mean in terms of speech styles and ellipses? So challenges with speech styles and ellipses suggest that learners found a discrepancy between how learners think language is used and how language is actually used in real life oral interaction. Such discrepancy occurs in regard to reference, such as dropping reference or dropping grammatical subjects and particles, as well as in relation to speech styles, such as changing verb forms or changing sentence final particles. This suggests that Japanese has less syntactic constraint and tolerates a different degree of explicitness. So in Japanese, utterances that are far from the proposition expressed are used and often preferred to communicate the speaker's thoughts. So the fact that there is such a huge gap between the proposition expressed and the linguistic form poses challenges for L2 learners, both at the production and at the interpretation side of interaction. So their linguistic choices are frequently inappropriate or cost too much processing effort without reward for L1 speakers. And at the same time, the linguistic choices of L1 speakers tend to cost too much processing effort without reward for L2 learners. So another difficulty is that in the classroom, so before they go to Japan, learners usually acquire a limited number of linguistic forms, and they learn one particular way of saying something, which results in the misassumption that this is the only particular way and the correct way of producing language. Learners soon become aware when they get to Japan of this mismatch between what they have learned and how language is actually used. But they don't know how to reduce the gap between these two in order to make interaction more efficient. So such discrepancy comes with high-stake consequences, as we saw in the first example, including pragmatic failure and interpersonal issues. So this would indicate that in the L2 classroom, before they went to Japan, learners should be made aware that there are gaps that need to be filled with conceptual representations for utterances to be fully propositional. Let's have a look at another challenge now, one that is related to prosodic effects at the utterance level. So prosody is not a feature of the language that learners particularly paid too much attention to or were aware of during their time in Japan. Data was rather contradictory in the sense that some learners found prosody to be very similar to English, and others found it to completely different and difficult to grasp. So for example, when discussing humor, some learners reported that prosody facilitated the understanding of humorous effects, while others mentioned that the lack of changes in prosody among Japanese speakers made it challenging to understand whether someone was making a joke or not. So some learners were aware of intonation as a means to convey meaning, while others didn't report such awareness. And we have two examples here of learners who did report awareness of prosody as a means to communicate meaning. So using the same example, learners had difficulties disambiguating sentence type. So in Japanese, the particle ka, or no, in the casual form as we have seen it, is used at the end of an utterance to indicate that the information conveyed is a question. But as we have seen, Japanese often omits particle ellipses, including those that mark sentence type at the end of the sentences. So L1 speakers often rely on prosody to retrieve the intended meaning or propositional attitude, but not learners. So learners seem to rely on syntactic cues rather than pragmatic ones to retrieve meaning. And more often than not, as shown in the quote here, learners could not understand that L1 speakers were asking a question. So here we have, am I supposed to answer, or was it just a comment? Yeah. And if learners didn't understand that it was a question, L1 speakers would have to make the effort to make it more obvious that they were actually asking a question, such as by including the final particle ka, or by exaggerating their intonation. Another challenge is that in Japanese, the meaning of some words drastically change when speakers use prosody to reflect their propositional attitude. So learners reported that disambiguating the meaning of such multifunction words was challenging, as they didn't know what the intention of the speaker was and what he was aiming to convey. And this specifically happened quite a bit with hedges or softening expressions and back-channeling. And here is an example. So the word chotto in Japanese means a little bit, but depending on how it is intonated, it can mean I'm sorry, but we're not going to do this, or yes, it is okay to do this. So of course that created quite a bit of confusion, because if they didn't know the kind of prosody they were using, they didn't know which meaning they had to pick from. And finally, at the production level, participants agreed that their use of prosody at the utterance level was pointed out as inappropriate or incorrect on several occasions. So this resulted in higher processing effort for Japanese speakers who could not disambiguate sentence type and propositional attitudes intended by learners. So it was the same problem as before, but in reverse. So learners did not have sufficient practice with prosody as an act of communication before going to Japan. And learners, as a result, were not always aware of how prosody functioned, or they were unable to convey emotion through prosodic features of the language. And they were frequently either consciously or unconsciously inclined to transfer L1 prosodic knowledge to their utterances in Japanese. So challenges with prosody suggest that learners were challenged by higher level explicatures. So as we know, the content of higher level explicatures remains representational. But there is a separate truth condition that conveys a higher level description, such as propositional attitudes or sentence type. So learners had difficulties interpreting and producing propositional attitudes and sentence types due to their lack of awareness of how prosody is used in oral interaction. That means that learners had difficulties both conveying and interpreting separate truth conditions to the main truth condition of the utterance, and that an effort needs to be made in the classroom before they go to Japan to make learners aware of how prosody is key to understand and convey meaning. Okay, the last challenge I would like to discuss, and I'm very conscious of time, so I'll try to be quick, is that of silence. And the literature demonstrates that Japanese employ silence to communicate meaning more frequently than in other societies, including English, and that silence is used to convey a great range of intentions. And when I say great range, it truly is a very long list of intentions. So the majority of participants found silence to be uncomfortable and awkward. So some participants described silence as one of the most disconcerting aspects of Japanese oral interaction. Even though learners attributed discomfort with silence to cultural differences between Japan and Ireland, they also felt that sometimes they were to blame for instances of silence in oral interaction, and frequently wondered if they had said something wrong or they had done something wrong because there was silence in conversation. So due to such discomfort with silence at the level of production, learners often opted not to conform to the pragmatic norms and adopted or even intensified their L1 pragmatic behavior. So for example, instead of remaining silent as the Japanese were doing, they would start asking questions like, what do you do? What do you like? What's your favorite movie? What's your favorite food? And they would just keep talking and talking and talking because they were just felt so uncomfortable. And that behavior in itself created discomfort among Japanese speakers, of course. So some learners considering silence was their fault, indicated a degree of awareness of silence as an ostensive communicative act, but they didn't know what the intended meaning behind silence was, and they could not disambiguate such meaning. So this resulted in higher processing effort for learners to derive the ostension of silence, resulting in an increasingly anxious, I would say, struggle to interpret its meaning. So, of course, this suggests that interpreting silence and not conforming to the uses of silence in oral interaction indicates that learners had difficulties with implicatures. So some learners could not understand silence as intended, that is, as an ostensive communicative act, while others could understand that silence was intended, but could not infer the content implicitly conveyed through silence. So if learners want to be competent and efficient communicators in DL2, they must become familiar with silence as a means to communicate meaning, and they must also be provided with the mechanisms to infer this extra layer of intention conveyed through silence. And that brings me to the implications of this research. We have identified a number of communicative acts that involve inference and that students find challenging. But what does this mean? So in spite of limited linguistic competence and contextual assumptions available, all learners communicated to varying degrees within their abilities and within their preferences. So learners were being the most relevant they could be with the knowledge available to them at that point in time. Even if communicative acts produced by learners were frequently costly for L1 speakers and even inappropriate, and even if communicative acts produced by L1 speakers were costly for learners, the data shows that learners interpreted and produced communicative acts following the principles of relevance. So the ostensive stimuli they produced were relevant enough to be worth the L1 speaker's effort to process them. But ostensive stimuli produced by L1 speakers were not always relevant enough for learners. So even if L1 speakers made manifest a basic layer of intention at times, learners could not attribute communicative intentions via inferential processing and could not reduce the gap between the logical form and the full proposition. The findings, and I'm finishing now, also lend support to the importance of teaching pragmatic competence to foreign or second language learners. So as demonstrated in the findings, there is still a huge gap between what learners need for real-life oral interaction and what is being taught in the classroom. So this shows that the need for more opportunities to enhance pragmatic competence among learners so they can make the inference of what is appropriate in a particular interaction in the classroom before they can apply it to real-life situations. So with that, learners would be made aware that there are other mechanisms through which relevance can be achieved. So of course, I argue that these notions, or that the notions within relevance theory are a better explanatory framework to examine pragmatic competence in DL2 than communicative approaches to interlanguage pragmatics, and that we can use relevance theory as an explanatory framework in the classroom as well to frame and explain challenging communicative acts. So using relevance theoretic notions, teachers can create language-specific activities and even pedagogical materials in general that help or may help students familiarize with situations in the L2 context. So such knowledge, I believe, would facilitate their oral interactions during their study abroad programs, work placements, and beyond. Thank you for listening. Any suggestion, input, question, comment is welcome. I'm sorry, I've been talking for ages.
Okay, thanks, Erika. Okay, okay, thank you. So it was about L2 learners developing L2 learners pragmatic competence and looking at from relevance theory perspective. While you're putting together your questions in your mind, I'm just gonna keep talking, but if you have any questions, please jump in. I think the biggest thing contribution making there is that a lot of IOP literature, especially in Japanese, was based on anecdotal evidence and focused very much on speech act, but you actually got data from learners and you analyzed it within the framework of relevance theory. So that itself is very, very useful. Now, I think, Brandis, did you raise your hand?
Yes. Okay, Erika, thank you very much for this. I thought it was very interesting because it helps teachers of Japanese offer remedial courses so that learners of Japanese will improve their pragmatic competence, will develop their pragmatic competence. So that I thought that was very, very interesting. I have a question regarding your methods.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you basically, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I heard you say that your method was questionnaires and also questionnaires and interviews, basically. Okay, questionnaires and interviews. So I was wondering, well, that basically suggests that the test subjects, let's call them test subjects, basically reported their own speech, right? The speech event. So that basically means they had to remember the original utterances. Is it possible that they couldn't remember the original utterances and they lost the story to a certain extent? And wouldn't it be a more reliable source of information if you observed a speech event yourself? I mean, wouldn't that be a more reliable source of information? Wouldn't it give you first-hand exposure to their infelicities?
Absolutely, I agree with you. Of course, observing and being there would have been ideal, but because of the time frame of my study, so my study, and I didn't mention that, is the methodology I used draws from design-based research, and design-based research has four main phases. The first phase would be the needs assessment. And needs assessment is always in collaboration with learners and practitioners, and it is about talking to them and questioning them, etc., etc. So yes, of course, being there and seeing the kind of utterances, the kind of oral interaction they had would have been absolutely ideal. And of course, I'm pretty sure at times they exaggerated their challenges, or they perhaps even downplayed their challenges when they were talking with me. But I give them the benefit of the doubt, and I think that the data that I came up with was so rich, and because I did 2 cycles of data collection with 2 different cohorts, and the challenges were the same with very similar types of utterances. Though, so for me, it's very hard to believe that they wouldn't be making it up or that it wasn't too accurate. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it definitely does. Thank you very much. I suppose it's within your plans to include this method, though, the observation kind of method, to your list of methods, right? Wouldn't you do that?
Yeah, that would be great. And it would also give me an idea of how Japanese speakers in this case use the language and responded to L2 speakers, to learners, because now I only have the learner side of things, but it would be very interesting to see what Japanese have to say about that and how they process information and how they make inferences when they talk to L2 learners.
Thank you.
Pauline?
Right, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Erika, for a great talk. That was really interesting and really highly relevant to my work, actually. My question is, do you think that those challenges can be culturally specific and due to the participants' L1s? So I'm not sure of the participants' L1s. Would it be English? Was it English only?
So, yeah, I should have mentioned that as well. Thank you for asking. So, no, not everyone's first language was English. There were a few learners whose first language was German, Lithuanian, Russian even, although the majority, it was either English and some of them Irish as their first languages. And perhaps it was culturally specific, of course, but at the same time, I would say that the type of challenges that they face, so challenges with higher explicatures, with implicatures, with the linguistic form and the proposition expressed, and that discrepancy could also be applied to any other language. So I don't think it's the case of Irish learners or English speakers have these challenges in specific, but I think everyone and every language has similar sort of challenges.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
No problem.
Okay. So any other comments or questions? Yeah, Mai?
Yes, hi, Erika. This is really interesting. Thank you for your presentation. I was actually just going to jump in from the previous question, so but in the opposite direction. So looking at how we can generalize over this, not talking about specific cultures, but to generalize. And I think you mentioned in the end that this could be useful for teachers of L2 in general, let's say, to develop mechanisms for overcoming those pragmatic problems or problems in pragmatic competence. So I was wondering if you were going to include in your thesis some ideas for how could that be developed in practice, like what kind of mechanisms L2 teachers can develop within the framework of relevance theory.
Yeah, so this is actually a great question because I have a whole chapter dedicated to just that. So with these challenges, what I have done is create a series of exercises or activities that might be useful for both teachers and learners to develop their pragmatic competence. And as I said, these are, of course, Japanese specific, but I think that the kind of activities that I am creating or thinking of could be applied to any other language. Yeah, in fact, because of COVID, I couldn't do it, but I was planning on implementing a course with these activities to see if learners could develop their pragmatic competence before they went to Japan. Because as I said, because of COVID, learners didn't go to Japan, so I could not implement the course. But the information is there and it's going to be part of my PhD thesis.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll be looking forward to reading that then.
Thank you.
Great. Any other comments, questions?
I can chip in. I thought it was really interesting. Thank you. Really excellent presentation as well. I agree with the comment that just came up that got a really fantastic, clear presentation style. It struck me. I've heard researchers in second language acquisition, particularly from phonetics perspective, talking about this distinction of they use the analogy of the classroom is like they use the analogy of kind of plants, and saying that when in the classroom it's like you're in a seed nursery and everything is very carefully maintained, and then you might maybe talk to some people and it's more like you're in a garden, and then when you go to the country it's like a jungle and it's just completely everything just goes crazy, and I've seen that from a phonetics perspective and how, you know, sounds assimilate differently and everything. And I think the same analogy probably applies to pragmatics as well then. And do we need to bring the jungle into the classroom perhaps somehow? I don't know. That was just a nice analogy. But I also wondered, and Ryoko might have something to say on this, do any of these misunderstandings happen between L1 speakers at all? Particularly with the ellipsis. I wonder if it's something that only happens with learners.
Not to the extent of L1, L2 interaction, I don't think. And yeah, we do sort of sometimes make joke out of sort of misunderstanding because of the ellipsis, but not to the extent learners struggle, I don't think.
I'm just thinking that sometimes in English people will say, are you asking me or telling me? Because with the prosodic issues, and I wondered if that maybe sometimes happens.
I'm pretty sure it happens, but perhaps we are just not aware of it. And that could be another thing as well. And with ellipsis, I would say perhaps, but for example, with the choice of speech styles, I think it is so ingrained in Japanese speakers that it just comes naturally. It's not even something that they learn in schools or anything like that. It's just something that they pick up from just being there. So I think yes, but not to the extent as it happens in L1, L2 interactions.
And I think Ellie had hands up earlier, or did I see?
Yes. Hi, Erika. Thank you for a very comprehensive presentation. I mean, it was very original, and the fact that you looked at a wide range of phenomena, both pragmatic and structural as well, you know, prosody, speech acts, ellipses, humor, etc., I think makes it very original and quite representative also of, you know, what goes on in real life context. So my question is a general one. If you can tell those difficulties and weaknesses and let's say challenges that you found encountered by your learners, were they predominantly, let's say, observed at the level of linguistic awareness or pragmatic awareness? If we go back to the definition of pragmatic competence that you mentioned.
I think there was a bit of both. So some of the challenges were definitely at the level of linguistic competence. And you see that more in the case of speech styles, for example, while other problems were more at the level of pragmatic awareness or metapragmatic awareness. So I think there's a nice balance combination, of challenges within those competencies there. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Yeah, recently, Erika and I were talking about, and I want to ask you, Erika, you just mentioned we do change style halfway through our discussion. So we may start with very polite form, and halfway through we're talking very colloquial, informal, almost rude form, and then we go back. And we somehow, native L1 speakers seem to know when to do that or when not to do that, but L2 speakers don't. Or sometimes they get it wrong. So how do you teach that sort of very intricate appropriateness of use language? And throughout your presentation, you're saying, you know, you need to they need to be taught real life use of language and so on. But if then we have to describe every single scenario of real life interaction situations, that's kind of similar to what communicative approach people in the community who take communicative approach would say. So how can you actually, maybe relating to some questions earlier, how can you actually teach pragmatic competence in relevant theory term without having to describe every single communicative situations? How do you want to approach this?
I think, well, first of all, it's impossible to teach absolutely every single aspect of a language in the classroom. First of all, time constraints, and second of all, it's just not realistic. So what I would say here is that you give students the awareness of what is happening in the language. So you tell them that this is what happens. So first, awareness. For example, speech styles change. They change within one single interaction. Here you have an example of it. And then perhaps give them some tools, mechanisms, activities even to experiment with that. So they have the knowledge. And with that knowledge, then they can go to Japan or they can interact in the L2 and have more evidence, more experience with that. So of course, I think like it's very tricky. In fact, it's very difficult, I would say, to teach every aspect of the language or teach all the meanings that silence have in Japanese. Like it's nearly impossible, but just give them some awareness, give them some practice, give them some mechanism so they can activate their inferential abilities on their own without help from the teacher.
Thank you. Now we are nicely coming to 18:30. So if we don't have any more questions, maybe we stop here. But thank you, Erika, for your really good presentation. Thank you, everyone, for your participation. Now, finally, just to plug in, we have the season 1 finale next month, 30th of June, is the talk by Christoph Heinz and Tom Scott Phillips. And the talk title is Relevance Theory and Diversity of Human Expression. This is the, I think it's already published elsewhere, but you can see the abstract and preprint here as well. Now, as I said, we have September and October. September, we have David Wilson giving us a talk, yes. But we have October almost sorted. But if you're interested in presenting in November and December for season 2, we'd love to hear from you. And you can just contact me or contact us by Twitter, or you can email Kate or me, or whatever way. If you happen to have our WhatsApp, you can do that too. So thanks again, everyone, and see you next month. Thanks, Erika.
Thank you.